and open this conversation here and I guess challenge our faith leaders. Actually, I'm not going to challenge them. The issue of climate change is a challenge to all of us. And we're really interested to hear the different faith traditions and how they address these issues related to the environment. Because just about, I think, every faith tradition has come to recognize that the environment and climate change in particular represents significant challenges to us all. Not just challenges in terms of science, but challenges in terms of policy, and then challenges in terms of ethical questions that are ones that faith traditions are always concerned about. And so with that, I wanted to kind of open the conversation with some of the issues that face us all as citizens of the world, and particularly as Americans who live in a wealthy country with our own disparities, but certainly may have some special responsibilities here. Current projections for climate change present a special moral challenge for Americans because we are a wealthy country, and because we've been polluting for a long time. Unless we act now and act aggressively, human-caused climate change is going to inflict unprecedented scale of human suffering on citizens across this world and in future generations. Unprecedented human suffering. We've talked about, we know the history of plagues, we know scourges like smallpox. Unfortunately, climate change has the potential to actually exceed, in terms of its human costs, all of those. And while environmentalists are oftentimes, caricatured as caring about polar bears, the point is that climate change is not just going to be impacting polar bears and critters that are out there. It's really going to have a tremendous human toll. And that's why it obviously presents a moral challenge for all citizens of the world, but for America in particular. These are complex problems, ethical questions and policy questions, and the answers are complex as well. There's an old saying that for every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and it's wrong. And when you have complex problems, you usually have to deal with complex solutions. It would be nice if we could find a simple way to deal with these issues, but unfortunately, we haven't come up with one. There are intergenerational justice questions. What do we owe future generations for the climate costs that we're imposing on them now, and our parents imposed on us? And how do we best compensate future generations, or at least ease the costs that we will impose on them? If when we talk about intergenerational, we're talking about the limits on lifestyle possibly in the future. Unless we find a smarter way to do things, we can find smarter ways to do stuff. But the amount of carbon that we're belching out right now is something that may not be available to future generations. And this is a question even in terms of supply. I mean, even if it weren't for climate change, do we have the right to burn all the fossil fuel today and leave none for future generations? That's a question that is out there. And we know that Native Americans, we hear about the 7 generations. So there's even in the American Native American tradition, there was questions raised with regard to what do we do, how do we care for future generations, and obviously I think all our faith traditions do that as well. There are questions of justice between classes as well. How do we fairly allocate the cost of carbon reduction and adaptation among our own citizens? For example, the coal miner that loses his job as we move away from coal to gas, to wind and solar. How do we deal with that issue? How do we provide justice in the coal fields as we move away from a dirty fuel? I was just down in Wise County, in part of the coal country, this past weekend, and there's a real need there. With some of the highest poverty levels in our state and our country are in Appalachia, despite the fact that the coal industry says that they bring wealth to our nation. Those areas where we extract coal are some of the poorest areas in the country. So how do we compensate between classes? Does the person who was impacted by Hurricane Katrina in the Ninth Ward in New Orleans, what do they pay? What are they paying now in terms of the impacts of that hurricane, which is likely attributable to climate change? How much do they pay versus a hedge fund manager? Okay, a poor person living in the Ninth Ward doesn't have a lot of cars necessarily. They don't have a really big house. And so if you're extremely wealthy and you've got 5 houses and 10 cars and you burn a lot of carbon, how do you apportion the cost between classes? How do we impose these charges fairly? Okay. Then there's questions of justice between nations and people. How do we compensate the poorest people in the world who actually aspire to the same comforts that we do? In order to achieve those same comforts, they decide to burn as much carbon as we do. So whether it's the Indians, or the Chinese, or emerging economies in Africa and other parts of Asia, where the quickest way to wealth is to burn coal and gas and oil. And these questions come up in the international negotiations regarding climate change. Do we compensate those countries, those poor countries, in some way to encourage them to move away from fossil fuels and to invest in wind and solar? A really good example of that is the cell phone, for example. For us, this is a development that evolved from landlines. But in countries in Asia and Africa right now, they never had landlines. They went right to the cell phone. Can we encourage these countries to skip fossil fuels and move right to solar, even if it might be more expensive? And if so, what do we owe them to do that? Because we're saying we'd rather you use solar or wind instead of carbon pollution. How do we encourage them to do that in a way that helps the climate? Okay. Another example between nations. Okay. We hear that Bangladesh has a very low-lying area. There are literally tens of millions of people will ultimately have to relocate. Immediately right now, countries like Tuvalu, these are small island nations, and the Maldives, in probably 10 or 20 years, those people are going to have to find another place to live. What do we do? What is our obligation to find a place for them to live? Do they move to Australia or New Zealand, which are close by, or to Indonesia? How do we deal with these questions as global citizens and also as Americans? You look at the Mekong Delta, Vietnam. It's the rice basket for much of Asia. So they're extremely susceptible to saltwater intrusion. Okay, as the saltwater goes up in the Mekong Delta, they're going to lose production, and that means literally millions of people could basically be threatened in terms of famine. Similarly, in terms of desertification and droughts in Africa. Interestingly enough, in a rich country like the United States, when we have a tragedy like Katrina or Sandy, we're able to bring tremendous wealth to compensate people. Now, obviously, the poor folks have more challenges, but even in our country, everyone almost everyone is helped in some way. Whereas in Latin America, when a hurricane wipes out the bridge and washes away a village because of landslides, who's there to help them rebuild? And think about that in terms of our obligations. If in fact these fiercer hurricanes are the result of climate change that we contribute to because of our lifestyle. Again, challenges that really face us as Americans and face us as citizens of the world. Now, how do we allocate a carbon budget between the countries and of the United States and Europe, and the other countries? This gets to the issue I raised earlier. How do we encourage Asia or Africa to skip fossil fuels and jump to wind and solar instead to help alleviate these problems of climate change we face? What obligation do richer countries have to share the technologies, these clean technologies, with other countries? So these are really interesting, I guess, and critically important ethical questions that we wrestle with here. And despite the gravity and the urgency of these questions, or perhaps because of the gravity and urgency of these questions, the United States has really not done a whole lot to address them. As Sarah said recently, President Obama has brought this question to us and is actually doing more than we've ever done before, and has raised this issue of a moral obligation to take this action. So I've sort of tried to frame that issue in a number of different ways: intergenerational, classes, between countries, and as Americans, and the lifestyle we have. And with that, I'm going to stop and look forward to the discussion from our faith leaders here in terms of these very tough questions.